The 100th Omega left the throne room, her scent a cloying mix of ambition and rosewater. King Jorn did not watch her go. He stared at the hearth, at the listless dance of the flames, feeling nothing. For 3 weeks they had been presented, 100 vibrant, hopeful, pedigreed Omegas from every territory, each one a potential balm for the kingdom's festering wound, each one a failure. His counsel shifted, the rustle of their robes like dry leaves. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of strained patience, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, that was the last of the candidates from the Northern Reach. Perhaps if you would engage—" "No," Jorn said. The word was flat, final. It fell into the cavernous silence of the hall and died. He had not truly spoken in weeks, not beyond the grunts and dismissals required of him. The grief in him was a physical thing, a feral wolf pacing a cage of bone, and none of these perfumed strangers could soothe it. Their scents were noise, their eagerness was an affront. He stood, the movement sharp enough to make the council flinch. He was a king, but he was an alpha first, and his sorrow had sharpened all his edges. He walked the length of the hall, his boots echoing on the stone. He wasn't looking for a queen. He wasn't looking for a mate. He was looking for quiet. For a moment in the second week, he had found it. A whisper of it. It hadn't come from any of the candidates. It had come from the passageway leading to the infirmary wing. A scent of snowmelt and winter herbs, of clean linen and something else, something like chamomile and baked bread. A scent of stillness. It had drifted past him, and for the first time in 5 years, the wolf inside him had stopped pacing. It had lifted its head, listened, and laid down. The peace had lasted only a moment before the scent was gone, swallowed by the cloying florals of the presentation. He had spent the next week searching for it, a phantom hunting a ghost. He'd caught it twice more, faint traces near the kitchens, by the servants' stairs. He had asked no one. To ask would be to give it a name, to make it real and risk it being taken. "Your Majesty," Valerius tried again, his tone placating. "The kingdom needs an Omega. The pack bond is frayed. Your grief is shared by all, but we must look to the future." Jorn stopped at the great doors. He turned, his gaze sweeping over their anxious faces. "There was another," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Not one of them." He gestured vaguely toward the throne. "She was here, in the palace. Small, quiet hair. She smelled of herbs." The council members exchanged confused glances. A servant? A kitchen maid? "Who?" Jorn's voice was harder now, a command. An undersecretary, a nervous man named Pell, scurried forward, shuffling through a roll of parchment. "There were many servants, Your Majesty. Kitchen staff, laundresses, tenders." "She was not a servant," Jorn said, though he did not know how he knew. "She worked in the infirmary, perhaps. Her hands were never idle." He had seen her once, a fleeting glimpse. A slip of a girl with pale brown hair braided down her back, her face bent over a bowl of steaming water. She hadn't looked up. She hadn't seemed to know a king was passing. Pell's face cleared with unpleasant recognition. "Ah, you mean the wolfless one. Finna." The name was spoken with a faint curl of contempt. "She was a tender, yes, a distant cousin to the Lady Ildra, brought along to assist with the children and any travel sickness." Finna. The name was soft, like the scent. Jorn felt it settle something in his chest. "Where is she?" Pell shifted, avoiding the king's eyes. "She was dismissed, Your Majesty. Sent away 3 days ago." The wolf in Jorn's chest rose to its feet, a low growl starting in his throat. "Dismissed for what?" "Theft, Your Majesty," Valerius supplied, his voice smooth and certain. "A silver locket belonging to Lady Ildra. It was best to handle it quietly, to avoid dishonor during the presentation. She was exiled to the Graywater Outpost. A kindness, really. It could have been the block." Jorn looked from Valerius's smug face to Pell's nervous one. He did not believe it. The scent of her had been clean, clear, honest. It was the scents in this room that were tangled with lies, ambition, jealousy, deceit. He turned without another word and strode from the hall. He knew where the Lady Ildra's chambers were. He also knew the scent of a lie. He followed his own senses, down the servant corridors, toward the small, sparse room the infirmary tenders used. It was empty, stripped bare. A cot, a small table, but the scent was here, faint but unmistakable. Snowmelt, chamomile, and the ghost of clean sorrow. On the floor, half tucked under the leg of the cot, was a small muslin sachet, no bigger than his thumb. He bent and picked it up. The scent bloomed, potent and pure. He closed his hand around it, the fragile cloth a brand against his palm. Theft. They had called her a thief and sent her away. They had sent his quiet away. And he would go and get it back. The cart jolted, throwing Fina against the rough sawn planks. Each rut in the frozen road was a fresh misery. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around the small, shivering body pressed against her side. Wrenn's face was pale, her dark eyes huge and frightened. She hadn't spoken since they'd been forced from the palace gates before dawn. "Just a bit longer," Fina murmured, her breath pluming in the frigid air. It was a lie. The Graywater Outpost was 2 days' journey, a place for disgraced soldiers and forgotten debts, a place to fade away. The guard driving the cart, a grim-faced man named Torvin, grunted without turning around. "Save your breath. The cold will take it anyway." Fina ignored him. She had been ignoring men like him her entire life. Men who saw her wolflessness as a deficiency, a stain. She was an omega by birth, but without an inner wolf, she was nothing. A broken vessel. Her own family had treated her as a burden, and her cousin Ildra had perfected the art of using Fina's quiet nature as a canvas for her own cruelty. The accusation of theft had been Ildra's final, masterful stroke. No one would question the word of a prime candidate for the throne against that of a wolfless servant. No one would notice she was gone. Except Wrenn. The little girl was an orphan, a kitchen stray Fina had taken under her wing, sharing her meager meals and mending her worn clothes. When Fina had been cast out, Wrenn had simply refused to be left behind, clinging to Fina's legs with a silent, desperate strength that had momentarily baffled the palace guards. In the end, it was easier to throw them both in the cart than to pry the child away. Wrenn shivered again, a full-body tremor. Fina unwrapped her own worn cloak and added it to the child's small bundle. The cold bit into her immediately through her thin tunic, sharp and deep. "Fool girl," Torvin muttered over his shoulder. "You'll freeze before we make the ridge." "She's colder," Fina said, her voice tight. Her protectiveness over Wrenn was a fierce, hot thing, the only fire she had left. She began rubbing the child's hands between her own, trying to force warmth into the small, icy fingers. She was a healer. It was the only gift the fates had given her to compensate for what they'd withheld. Her hands could soothe fevers, ease pain, knit flesh. But they could not conjure fire from frozen air. They traveled on, the sky a sheet of bruised pewter above them. The landscape grew bleaker, the pines thinning to reveal stark, wind-swept hills. This was the edge of the kingdom, the place where maps frayed. Fina felt her own hope fraying with it. She had survived her childhood. She had survived the scorn of her pack. She had survived Ildra's petty torments. But she wasn't sure she could survive being erased. As dusk bled across the snow, they reached the outpost. It was less a settlement and more a scar. A handful of squat, turf-roofed buildings huddled behind a crumbling palisade, a plume of greasy smoke sullying the clean air. Torvin reined in the horses. "This is it. End of the line." He gestured to the smallest, most isolated cabin, set apart from the others near the edge of a dark wood. "That one's yours. Don't expect a welcome." He unloaded their single bag, a pathetic collection of spare clothes and a few dried apples, and tossed it into the snow. Fina slid out of the cart, her limbs stiff and aching, and lifted Wrenn down. The child buried her face in Fina's side, overwhelmed. "There's wood stacked by the door," Torvin said, his gruffness a thin veil over something that might have been pity. "A week's worth of rations inside. After that, you're on your own." He wouldn't meet her eyes. He climbed back onto the cart, ready to leave them in this purgatory. "Wait," Fina said, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" Torvin paused, the reins loose in his hands. He stared at the darkening woods. "Some people can't abide seeing a simple thing shine brighter than they do," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. Then he slapped the reins and the cart rumbled away, leaving Fina and Wrenn alone in the vast, encroaching silence of the north. A mournful howl echoed from the woods, and a stray wolf dog, its fur the color of soot and its ribs showing, padded out from the trees. It stopped a dozen paces away, watching them with intelligent, wary eyes. Wrenn, who was usually terrified of everything, pointed a small finger. "Look," she breathed, "he's all alone too." The wolf dog whined softly, a sound of shared desolation. Fina looked from the abandoned animal to the abandoned child to the abandoned hut that was now her home, and felt a kinship so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. They were the forgotten things, the discards, and here, at the edge of the world, they had only each other. Jorn rode for 2 days, the small muslin sachet tucked inside his tunic, a warm spot of truth against his skin. He rode without a guard, without a banner, just a lone alpha on a black warhorse, following a scent that was already fading on the wind. The wolf inside him, the one that had been snarling or sleeping for 5 years, was awake and running with him. It tasted the air, tracked the memory of chamomile and snow, and pulled him north. His council thought him mad. They believed his grief had finally broken him, sending him chasing after a disgraced, wolfless servant. They did not understand. His grief was not a weakness, it was a wall. A fortress of ice he had built around the memory of his first mate, Elspeth, and the plague that had taken her and a quarter of the pack. The pack bond had been savaged, leaving a shared, psychic wound that never healed. Jorn, as the alpha, felt it most keenly, a constant, low-grade agony, a hum of loss that soured every victory and hollowed every peace. The 100 Omegas had been meant to mend that bond, a new mate for the alpha, a new heart for the pack. But their sense, their vitality, their very wholeness had been like salt on the wound. They were trying to replace what was lost. But Fina, her scent was different. It didn't try to fill the empty space. It soothed the edges of it. It was a scent of acceptance, of quiet mending. It promised not a new fire, but a warm hearth. It promised peace. He didn't know what he would do when he found her. He had no plan beyond finding her. He could not command her to return. He could not force her to be his queen. The alpha in him, the king, knew that. But the man, the grieving wreck of a man, simply needed to be in the presence of that quiet again, to see if it was real. He found the Graywater Outpost as the first flakes of a coming blizzard began to spin in the air. It was as grim as its name, a place that reeked of stale beer and despair. Her scent was almost gone, buried under the grime and the wind, but it was here. He followed the faint trail, a thread of chamomile leading him away from the main longhouse toward a small, isolated hut. Light, pale and thin, flickered in the single window. Smoke curled from the chimney. He dismounted, his horse steaming in the cold. The scent was stronger here, and it was mingled with something else, the smell of a child and of a dog. He walked to the door, his heart hammering in a way it hadn't for years. It was not the excitement of a king claiming his prize, it was the terror of a starving man approaching a feast he might be turned away from. He raised his hand to knock and hesitated. What would he say? "I am your king, I have come for you." The words tasted like ash. They were the words of a tyrant, a taker. And his instincts, the ones that had been screaming at him for days, told him that this girl, this Finna, could not be taken. She could only be offered something and hoped she would accept. Through the rough-hewn door, he heard a small voice, clear as a bell. "Is he still out there?" And then her voice, low and gentle. "Yes, Wrenn, the dog is still there." "He looks hungry," the child said. "Can we give him some of our bread?" "We don't have much, little bird, but yes, we can spare a piece." Jorn stood frozen in the thickening snow, listening to this small act of charity. This girl, cast out with nothing, was sharing her meager food with a stray. They had called her a thief. The injustice of it was a physical blow. He lowered his hand from the door. He could not knock. He could not burst into their fragile sanctuary as a king. He was an intruder here, a storm on their horizon. The blizzard was growing worse, the wind starting to howl. He needed shelter, but he would not demand it. He would wait. He pulled his cloak tighter, leaned against the frozen wall of the hut, and let the snow begin to cover him, the scent of her peace just a thin wooden plank away. The wind rattled the hut's poorly fitting door, and a fine powder of snow sifted through the cracks. Finna sat on the floor by the small, sputtering fire, sharing a piece of dry bread with Wrenn. The wolf dog, who Wrenn had decided to name Soot, sat just inside the doorway, which Finna had left open a crack. He had eaten the bread she'd offered him with a solemn delicacy, and then simply refused to leave, positioning himself as a furry, silent guardian against the storm. "The wind is loud," Wrenn whispered, leaning her head against Finna's knee. "It's just a storm," Finna soothed, stroking the child's hair. "We're safe in here. We have fire and we have Soot to protect us." The dog's ears twitched, and he let out a low, soft whine, his gaze fixed on the door. A moment later, a heavy knock sounded, shaking the entire frame. It was not the knock of a lost traveler. It was solid, deliberate. Finna's heart leaped into her throat. Torvin? Had he come back? Or someone else from the outpost, looking for trouble? She scooped Wrenn behind her, her body a shield. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Then a voice that was not Torvin's. It was low and rough, scraped raw by the wind. "I need shelter from the storm." It was a request, not a demand, but the power in that voice, it resonated deep in her bones, in a place that had never responded to anyone. Soot did not bark. He rose to his feet, but his tail gave a single, tentative wag. Finna hesitated. To open the door was a risk. To refuse, in a blizzard like this, was a death sentence. Her healer's instincts warred with her fear. "We have little room," she said, stalling, "and little food." "I have my own supplies," the voice answered. "I only ask for a roof." Slowly, her hand shaking, Finna rose and went to the door. She drew the wooden bolt, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled the door inward. The man standing there was a giant, cloaked and hooded, his form almost lost in the swirling snow. He was covered in it, as if he'd been standing out there for a long time. When he pushed back his hood, her breath caught. It was the king. King Jorn. His face was harsher than it had looked in the palace, carved from granite and shadow, his dark hair dusted with snow. But his eyes, she had not seen his eyes up close before. They were a startling gray, the color of the winter sea, and they were filled with a grief so vast it seemed to suck the air from the small cabin. He did not look at her as a king looks at a subject. He looked at her like a man drowning, his gaze fixed on her as if she were the last piece of solid land in the world. He did not command. He did not enter. He waited. Behind her, Wrenn peeked out. The child, who feared strangers, showed no fear now. She looked at the formidable king, at his sad eyes and the snow in his hair, and her small face softened with a child's unfiltered empathy. "You look cold," Wrenn said, her voice small but clear. She stepped forward, past Finna's protective stance. "And you look sad, like Soot before we gave him the bread." The king's gaze dropped to the child. The harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, just for a second. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I am," he said, his voice quiet. Finna stood frozen, caught between the terrifying power of the man and the undeniable pain in his eyes. He was the reason she was here. His silent judgment in the throne room, his disinterest, had allowed Ildra's lie to flourish. He was the embodiment of the system that had cast her out. And yet, he was not demanding. He was asking. He was waiting for her permission. "Come in," she heard herself say, the words feeling alien in her own mouth. "Before the storm takes you." He stepped across the threshold, bringing the chill of the outside world with him. But as the door closed behind him, sealing the three of them, and one wolf dog, inside the tiny cabin, Finna felt a strange shift in the air. It was not the feeling of being trapped with a predator. It was the feeling of a storm, a much larger and more dangerous storm being brought to heel. The king was sick. He tried to hide it, sinking down with his back to the wall, his long legs stretched out before him, his cloak still wrapped tight. He had said nothing, only watched the fire, his presence a silent, thrumming weight in the small room. But Finna, whose life had been spent observing the subtle signs of pain, saw it. She saw the unnatural flush high on his cheekbones, the slight tremor in the hand he rested on his knee, the sheen of sweat on his brow that had nothing to do with the fire's heat. Wrenn, now comfortable with their brooding guest, had brought him her most prized possession, a smooth, gray stone she'd found by a river. He had accepted it with a grave nod, his large, calloused fingers closing around the small offering as if it were a royal seal. Soot, to Finna's astonishment, had left his post at the door and laid down a few feet from the king, his head on his paws, watching him with patient, yellow eyes. "You are injured," Finna said. It was not a question. Jorn's gaze lifted from the fire to her. He did not seem surprised that she had noticed. "It is an old wound. The cold has settled in it." "Let me see," she said, her healer's instincts overriding her fear of him. He hesitated. For a king, for an alpha, showing weakness was a dangerous thing. But then he gave a short, sharp nod of consent. Finna knelt before him, her senses on high alert. This was the man whose indifference had condemned her, but he was also a living creature in pain, and she could not turn away from that. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the thick leather of his tunic. "Where?" "My side," he rasped, his voice tight. With careful movements, she helped him unfasten the cloak and push aside the layers of his tunic and mail. The flesh of his left side was a ruin of puckered scar tissue, angry and red around a newly inflamed gash that was weeping fluid. It smelled of infection. "This is no old wound," she murmured, her professional focus absolute. "This is freshly torn." "The journey," he admitted, his breath catching as her fingers gently probed the edges of the infection. "A fall." She met his eyes. He had ridden for 2 days, wounded and feverish, to find her. The thought was so staggering she could not fully process it. She pushed it away. This needs to be cleaned and dressed, or the fever will take you. She moved to her small bag, her hands steady as she pulled out her packets of herbs. Yarrow to cleanse, comfrey to knit, and willow bark for the fever. She crushed them in her small stone bowl, adding hot water from the kettle by the fire. The scent of the poultice filled the cabin, clean and earthy, overpowering the smell of sickness. It was her scent, the scent of her work, her purpose. As she knelt to apply the warm mash of herbs to his side, his hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. His grip was not painful, but it was absolute. His eyes were clouded with fever now, his defenses crumbling. "Quiet," he murmured, his voice a low growl. "It's so quiet." He wasn't talking about the room. Fina understood instinctively. He was talking about the effect she had on him, the effect her scent, her presence had on the storm inside him. Her own heart stuttered. This was more dangerous than his anger, more terrifying than his power. This was a need she could not possibly fill. She stayed still, letting him hold her wrist, her pulse beating against his thumb. "The herbs will help," she said softly. His eyes drifted closed, his grip loosened, his hand falling away. He began to speak, his words slurred by the fever, fragments of a pain he'd held in for years. "The bond, torn. So much noise, screaming, 5 years of it." He shifted, a pained groan escaping his lips. "But your scent, like stillness after a battle." Fina's breath hitched. He was the alpha of alphas, the king of the north, and he was unraveling before her. He was speaking of the great plague, the one that had taken his mate. The entire kingdom knew the story, but they spoke of the king's grief as a noble, remote thing. Here, in this tiny hut, it was a raw, festering wound, just like the one in his side. She gently pressed the poultice to his hot skin. He flinched, but then a long sigh shuddered through him. The herbs and something more began their work. She bandaged the wound with a strip of clean linen, her movements efficient and sure. When she was done, she sat back on her heels. Wrenn had fallen asleep by the fire, a small, trusting bundle. Soot had crept closer, resting his head on the king's outstretched leg. And the king himself had finally succumbed to a true, healing sleep, his breathing evening out, the harsh lines of his face easing in the firelight. Fina looked at the scene, the outcast healer, the orphan child, the stray dog, and the broken king. A collection of broken, lonely things huddled together against the storm. She felt a strange, aching tenderness bloom in her chest. She had been so afraid of him, but his pain was a language she understood far better than power. The blizzard raged for 2 days, locking them in their small, snow-drowned world. The hut became an island in a sea of white. Time slowed, measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of their shared survival. Jorn's fever broke on the second morning, leaving him weak but lucid. The silence between him and Fina was no longer heavy with fear, but with a watchful, fragile curiosity. He did not act like a king. He chopped wood from the pile she'd hauled inside before the storm hit, his movements slow but steady. He cleaned and sharpened her small skinning knife with his own whetstone. He listened, truly listened, as Wrenn chattered on about the birds she imagined lived in the forest, her shyness with him completely gone. Fina, in turn, moved around him with a guarded grace. She changed his dressing, her touch professional and impersonal, yet her proximity sent a jolt through him every time. She made a thin, savory broth from their dwindling rations, and he watched her hands as she worked, the way she moved with an economy born of scarcity. "Why did you leave the palace?" he asked on the second afternoon. His voice was quiet, stripped of its royal command. It was just a man's question. Finna was stirring the pot, her back to him. She could feel his gaze on her, as tangible as a touch. She had expected this question. She had practiced the safe answers. But looking at the sleeping form of Wrenn, at the trusting weight of Soot's head on Jorn's boot, the easy lies caught in her throat. "I was sent away," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "For stealing," he stated. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact he was laying between them, to see what she would do with it. She turned from the fire, her wooden spoon held tight in her hand. "My cousin, the Lady Ildra, said I stole her locket." "Did you?" His gray eyes were steady, unreadable. Finna looked at him, at this powerful man who had followed her into exile, who had bled in her hut, who had called her scent quiet. And for the first time in her life, she felt the ground firm up beneath her feet. "No," she said. The word was small, but it was solid. It was the truest thing she owned. Jorn gave a single, slow nod. He had known. He had known from the scent of her, from the scent of Ildra's lie. He did not say, "I believe you." He did not need to. His presence here was the only declaration that mattered. Later, as twilight painted the single window a deep, bruised blue, he was carving a piece of firewood with his knife. Finna watched the shavings fall to the floor. His hands were huge, scarred from battle, but they moved with a surprising delicacy. Slowly, the shape of a bird emerged from the wood, a small, plump creature with its head cocked, full of life. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. When he was finished, he rubbed it smooth and held it out to Wrenn, who was watching, mesmerized. "For your forest," he said. Wrenn took the bird with reverent hands. She looked at Jorn, her expression solemn. "You should stay with us," she announced. "Finna needs help chopping wood, and Soot likes you." A ghost of a smile touched Jorn's lips, a rare, startling thing. It changed his entire face, hinting at the man he might have been before grief had remade him. But the smile faded as his eyes met Finna's over the child's head. The question was there, unspoken. It wasn't Wrenn's choice to make. He waited. He was always waiting, she realized. Waiting for her to speak, to choose, to grant permission. He had all the power in the world, yet with her, he wielded none of it. He offered, and he waited. It was the most profound respect she had ever been shown. The storm was ending. She could feel it in the air, a lessening of the pressure, a quietening of the wind's howl. Their time on this island was coming to a close. The world, with all its lies and expectations, would soon rush back in. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low, intimate in the dim light. She blinked. He knew her name. Pell had said it, but he was asking her for it. "Finna," she whispered. He said it back to her, tasting the shape of it. Finna. It was not the dismissive curse her family had made it. It was not the overlooked title of a servant. In his mouth, her name sounded like a discovery, like a destination. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she felt something terrifying and beautiful take root in the frozen ground of her heart. The morning of the third day, the world was born anew, swaddled in a blinding blanket of white. The silence was absolute. Torvin, the guard who had exiled her, appeared at their door as Finna was coaxing the fire back to life. He looked haggard, his face etched with worry. He took in the scene, the king, pale but whole, sitting by the fire, the child playing with a carved bird, the wolf dog at the king's feet, and his jaw went slack. He dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty, we thought... the storm..." "I was given shelter," Jorn said, his voice once again holding the quiet authority of a king. He looked at Torvin, his gaze sharp. "You were paid." It was not a question. Torvin flinched as if struck. He did not look at Jorn, he looked at Finna, and the shame in his eyes was a raw, open thing. Yes, Your Majesty. By whom? Torvin's gaze dropped to the floorboards. He was a hard man, a soldier who had seen battle, but he crumbled under the weight of the king's quiet interrogation. The Lady Ildra, he confessed, his voice thick. She paid me to bring them here, to make sure the girl never came back. A terrible stillness filled the hut. The lie was out, stark and ugly in the clean morning light. Finna felt the blood drain from her face. She had known Ildra was cruel, but this was a different level of malice. This was not just spite, it was an execution, slow and cold. Jorn's fury was not hot, it was a chilling, absolute cold. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. He rose slowly to his feet, a looming tower of controlled rage. He looked down at the cowering guard, then his eyes moved to Finna. She stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, waiting for the explosion. But it did not come. He held that terrifying stillness inside him, a storm kept behind a wall of sheer will. He looked at her, and his gaze was not one of pity, it was a promise. "She will not have you," he said, the words a vow of iron. He was not speaking to Torvin, he was speaking to her. He was undoing the exile, negating the lie, claiming her not as property, but as a person to be defended. Finna felt the dam of her composure crack. The fear, the humiliation, the lonely resignation she had lived with for years, it all threatened to overwhelm her. There was one more truth, the one that sat at the very heart of her shame. He had to know. He had to know the full extent of her unworthiness before this went any further. "I am wolfless," she said, the words tearing from her throat, raw and painful. "I am an omega who cannot shift. I have no inner wolf. I am broken, a flaw in the pack." She finally said it to him, the thing that defined her, the reason she was an outcast. She braced for the inevitable rejection, for the flicker of disgust, the polite withdrawal. Every alpha she had ever known had recoiled from this truth. It was a genetic dead end, a failure of their kind. Jorn did not recoil. He simply watched her, his gray eyes searching her face. The fury in him subsided, replaced by an unnerving calm. He took a step closer, into her space. He smelled of wood smoke and iron and the faint, clean scent of the herbs she had used to heal him. "I have spent 5 years surrounded by the strongest wolves in the kingdom," he said, his voice low and intense. "I have felt their strength, their grief, their rage, their pride. It is a constant storm, a cacophony. I am the alpha. I hear it all." He paused, holding her gaze. "But the scent of you, Finna, wolfless as you are, is the only true pack scent I have felt since the plague. It is not a flaw, it is quiet, it is peace, and it is the only thing my wolf recognizes as home." The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking than any declaration of war, more intimate than any touch. He was not just accepting her lack, he was naming it as the very thing he needed. The curse she had carried her entire life, he was calling a gift. It was too much to comprehend. Her world, which had been so small and sharp and painful, suddenly tilted on its axis, revealing a landscape she had never imagined possible. The sound of horses broke the spell. A dozen riders, their banners brilliant against the snow, were picking their way toward the outpost. They were royal guards, an honor detail, and at their head, cloaked in white fur and radiating smug triumph, was Ildra. Torvin scrambled to his feet. "Your Majesty, you must hide. They were sent by the council to retrieve you." His eyes darted toward Finna. "And to deal with the exile permanently." Deal with her. The words were a death sentence. Finna's blood ran cold. Ildra had not been content with exile. She had sent executioners. Jorn did not move. He stood his ground, a bulwark of calm in the face of the coming threat. He looked at Finna, at the terror that must have been plain on her face. "No one will deal with you," he said, his voice a low promise. He walked to the door and opened it, stepping out into the blinding sun. Fina, Wrenn, and Torvin watched from the doorway as the riders approached. Soot stood beside Jorn, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ildra dismounted with practiced elegance, her gaze sweeping over Jorn's travel-worn state with feigned concern. "Your Majesty! We were so worried. The council feared the worst when you vanished. To come all this way for a trivial matter of justice." Her eyes flickered to Fina in the doorway, her expression a mask of contemptuous pity. "But you are safe. We will escort you back to the palace. The guards can finish the task here." Jorn did not acknowledge her words. He just watched as she approached, her confidence absolute. She had been winning for so long, she had forgotten how to lose. "The presentation is concluded, Jorn," Ildra said, her tone softening, becoming proprietary. "The council has approved our match. It is the most logical choice. Our lines are strong. We can heal the pack, you and I." She reached out to touch his arm. And then Jorn moved. It was the first time Fina had ever seen him move toward someone without invitation. He took a single step, placing himself directly between Ildra and the hut. Between Ildra and Fina. It was a simple movement, but it was a declaration. A wall. "There is no match," Jorn said, his voice flat and cold as the winter sea. "The council does not choose my mate." Ildra's hand froze in midair. A flicker of disbelief, then fury crossed her face. "She is a wolfless stray, a thief! She is nothing! She will weaken the pack, taint your line. You are choosing this half thing over the good of the kingdom?" "She is not the weakness in this pack," Jorn said, his gaze unwavering. "You are. Your ambition. Your lies." He looked past Ildra to the captain of the guard. "Captain, the Lady Ildra's claims of theft were false. She is to be escorted back to her family's estate and confined there. Her status at court is revoked." The captain, a veteran loyal to the crown above all else, looked from the king's implacable face to Ildra's sputtering rage and made his choice. "Yes, your Majesty." Ildra stared, aghast, as two guards moved to her side. Her perfect world, built on a foundation of careful cruelty, had just shattered. Her face contorted with a vicious, desperate hatred, all of it directed at Fina. "You will regret this. He will tire of you, you pathetic little waif, and when he casts you aside, there will be nowhere left for you to run." She was led away, still shrieking threats, her ugliness finally exposed to the clean, cold light of day. The remaining guards sat on their horses, waiting for their king's command, but Jorn did not look at them. He turned his back on the entire apparatus of his power, the guards, the politics, the kingdom, and faced Fina. He stood there, in the snow, his heart in his eyes. He had defended her. He had destroyed her tormentor. He had claimed her as worthy. But he did not command her. He did not presume. He held out his hand. A large, scarred alpha's hand, an offering. "Come home," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of everything but the truth of his need. "With me." Fina looked at his outstretched hand. Behind him, the kingdom waited. The palace, the council, a life she could not imagine. It was terrifying. But then she looked at his face, at the man who saw her not as broken, but as peace. The man who waited for her to choose. She looked back at Wrenn, who was smiling, her small hand tucked in Fina's. She looked at Soot, who sat patiently by Jorn's side as if he belonged there. This was her pack, the broken king, the orphan child, the stray dog. A found family, here at the edge of the world. Slowly, she stepped out of the shadows of the hut and into the sunlight. She placed her small, trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. It felt like an anchor. It felt like coming home. Their return to the palace was not the triumphant spectacle Ildra would have engineered. It was a quiet, unsettling arrival. King Jorn rode through the main gates not with a blushing new Omega bride on a white mare, but with a pale, plainly dressed woman on his own warhorse seated before him. A small, dark-eyed child rode with the captain of the guard, and a rangy wolf dog trotted alongside the king's horse as if it had been doing so its entire life. Whispers followed them through the courtyards like a rustling wind. Finna kept her eyes fixed on the space between her horse's ears, her hand clutching the worn fabric of Jorn's tunic. His arm was a solid, warm presence around her waist, a silent shield. They did not go to the throne room or the great hall. Jorn led them through winding back passages to the royal wing, to a set of rooms that were quiet and filled with pale winter light. An older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver-streaked hair was waiting for them. Her name was Maeva, and she had been Elspeth's personal attendant, the keeper of the pack's heart. Her gaze was assessing, missing nothing. She looked at Jorn, then at Finna, her expression softening with a wisdom that went beyond court politics. "So," Maeva said, her voice dry but not unkind, "you found the quiet place." She turned to Finna, offering a slight, respectful bow of her head. "Welcome, my lady. We have been waiting for you." Maeva took Wrenn by the hand, her stern face melting into a grandmotherly tenderness as she promised the child a hot bath and a cake with honey. She led the little girl away, leaving Finna alone with Jorn in the center of the grand sitting room. Ildra was dealt with as Jorn had promised. There was no trial, no public shaming. Her name was simply erased. Her family was sent a quiet message. Her power, built on whispers and threats, dissolved into nothing. But the larger problem remained. The council was in an uproar. The pack bond was still frayed. Jorn had brought back a wolfless Omega, a perceived flaw, and presented her as the cure. "They do not understand," Finna whispered, looking out the tall window at the palace grounds below. "They will not accept me." "I do not need them to accept you," Jorn said, coming to stand behind her. "I need them to accept their king. And my choice." He paused. "But the pack is different. It is not a council to be commanded. It is a heart to be healed." He led her from the room, down a long, quiet corridor to a set of old, carved wooden doors. He pushed them open. The room beyond was circular, with a domed ceiling painted with stars. In the center of the floor was a mosaic of a great sleeping wolf. This was the heart chamber, the place where the alpha's bond connected to the entire pack, a place of immense psychic resonance. Since the plague, it had been a place of pain. To enter it was to be flooded with the pack's collective grief. Finna hesitated at the threshold. She could feel it, a low hum of sorrow vibrating in the stone. "I will not ask you to do this if you do not wish it," Jorn said, his voice low. "But I believe you are the only one who can." She looked at him, at the faith in his eyes. He believed her perceived curse was a gift, that her emptiness was a vessel for healing. Taking a deep breath, she stepped across the threshold. The grief hit her like a physical wave. It was 1,000 voices screaming in silence. Loss, fear, loneliness, anger. It was the echo of the plague, the raw, unhealing wound of the pack. It should have torn her apart, but it didn't. Because she was wolfless, she had no inner wolf to be battered by the storm. She was an empty space, a quiet harbor. The raging sea of the pack's grief washed into her, and instead of being destroyed, it simply stilled. The screaming faded to a murmur, the raging waves to a gentle tide. She did not take the pain away, she simply held it, giving it a place to be quiet. Jorn had followed her in, and he stood, watching, his face a study in awe. He could feel it, the shift, the easing of the pressure that had been crushing him for 5 years. The wolf inside him, which had been pacing its cage of his ribs, finally lay down, its head on its paws, and slept a true, deep sleep. He crossed the room to her. The air was calm. The chamber was at peace. He stopped before her, and for the first time, she saw the man he was without the weight of his grief. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but also the hint of a smile she now knew was real. He did not speak. Words were too small for this moment. He simply raised his hands and cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. And then he lowered his head and pressed his forehead to hers. It was not a kiss. It was more intimate, a vow, a silent, soul-deep recognition. I have found you. You are home. 2 years passed. The snow was falling again, fat, lazy flakes drifting past the tall, arched window of the Queen's solar. Finna sat in a comfortable chair, a sketchbook open on her lap, a charcoal pencil in her hand. She was not sketching the snow or the winter gardens below. She was sketching the face of a sleeping child. Wrenn, now a bright, confident girl of 8, was curled on a pile of cushions by the fire, a thick book of histories fallen open on her chest. At Finna's feet, Soot, now a glossy, well-fed wolf dog with streaks of gray at his muzzle, sighed in his sleep. The kingdom was healing. The frayed edges of the pack bond, soothed by Finna's quiet presence, had begun to knit back together. The constant, low hum of grief had faded, replaced by a sense of calm resilience. She was not the queen they had expected, this quiet, wolfless woman who preferred the infirmary and the library to the throne room. But she was the queen they had needed. She did not rule by command, but by compassion. She mended things, a child's scraped knee, a courtier's anxious heart, a kingdom's broken spirit. The door opened softly. Jorn entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He wore no crown, no fine silks, just the simple wool tunic and breeches of a northern lord. He had learned, with her, that peace was not found in power, but in its absence. He handed her a mug, the scent of chamomile and honey rising from it. He did not speak, just looked at what she was sketching. A small smile touched his lips. He ran a hand over Wrenn's sleeping head, his touch gentle. The fierce, grieving king was gone, replaced by this quiet, tender man. The grief was not erased, she knew. It was a scar he would always carry, a part of his story, but it no longer defined him. He came to stand behind Finna's chair, setting his hand on her shoulder. His other hand came to rest on the slight, firm curve of her belly, where their child grew beneath her heart. She leaned back against him, her head resting against his chest, her hand covering his on her stomach. This was their victory, not the cheering crowds or the vanquished enemies. It was this: the silent room, the sleeping child, the faithful dog, the warmth of the fire, the taste of tea, the gentle weight of his hand. An ordinary, miraculous peace. The first snow, he murmured into her hair, his voice a low, contented rumble. It's beautiful, she whispered back, closing her eyes, letting the quiet of the moment fill her completely. He bent his head, his lips brushing her temple. He did not say, I love you. He had said it only once, on the night they were finally, fully mated, a desperate, broken whisper in the dark. He did not need to say it again. His every action was the word made manifest. Instead, he just said her name, the sound a perfect, peaceful chord in the stillness of the room. Finna. And she smiled. It was all he ever needed to say. It was everything.